the basis of all independence.
Hello, this is Dr. V's Revolution Will Not Be Pesticides, and this is a follow-up video to my convenience video, where I was talking about how don't always choose convenience. But in the other video, I was talking about it more from a physical and mental perspective. You know, don't always park in the nearest parking spot to the grocery store. Don't always take the elevator, or don't always use your GPS everywhere you go. And because you don't obviously want to make yourself a very weak individual, physically or mentally. But I also want to talk about this from more of an economic or even a political standpoint. You know, in a historical context. When I say don't always choose convenience, I think about the history of West Africa, because me being a historian of the African diaspora and of West Africa, you know, it's very interesting when you learn about what West Africa experienced and how Europe was able to underdevelop Africa. There's a book by Walter Rodney called How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, published in 1982. And one of the things he talks about is the fact that a lot of these indigenous West African societies used to produce a lot of the things that they ended up getting from the outside, from the Europeans. But producing something independently usually takes a little bit more effort and a little bit more work and a little bit more ingenuity, right? And we talked about in previous videos how like certain West African societies were iron producers. They produced bronze. They produced a number of things that once the Europeans started sailing along the west coast of Africa, and due to their trade that they had, their maritime trade that they developed by connecting themselves with all these different groups all over the world, whether it was in Asia or in the Americas, the Europeans were able to provide some of the things that the Africans produced independently. They were able to trade these things in abundance, or offer these things in abundance to the Africans. So in other words, the Portuguese were offering all of these fancy wares and all of these fancy things, these iron products and even guns and things like that, to the Africans in abundance. Whereas the Africans used to produce many of these things independently. But once they started to grow a dependency on these things, this is when you start to see the production within Africa, independent, autonomous production within Africa, start to come to a halt, right? And they start depending on outsiders for these things. And this is where once and I talk about this in another video, but once you see the Europeans, because initially one of the reasons why they're going to Africa in the first place, wanted to trade with the Africans, because the Africans had an abundance of gold. So the Africans were exporting gold, and they were importing iron and guns and gunpowder and things like that into the African continent. So while the Europeans were first getting gold, the Africans were getting guns. But once the Europeans had actually found their own gold and their own silver in the Americas, there was no longer a dependency that they had on these things in West Africa. So with the new demand that the Europeans had, the new thing that they needed was labor. And so eventually the Africans had developed an addiction and a dependency on European trade, because they were no longer producing a lot of these things locally. Production was coming from the outside. And so what ends up happening in a place like West Africa is all internal production comes to a halt. There starts to depend upon the outside for the guns and for the iron and for the gunpowder and things like that. And so when the Europeans decide that they no longer need the gold and some of the things that got them to trade in Africa in the first place, the Africans are now willing to offer anything to be able to still get the guns and still get some of those things in which the Africans had stopped producing in the past. So the Europeans start demanding labor. Africans are willing to provide that labor because they develop a dependency on the trade. So whereas Africans are getting means of destruction, the guns, the Europeans are getting the means of production, the labor. And this is where Africa grows a dependency on European trade, because they stopped producing for themselves, because they chose convenience Rather than working hard and producing these things locally within Africa, as they had done in the past, they chose convenience, a simple trade or a simple purchase of the iron coming from the outside. I had a student once that said to me, why did the Africans make that choice? And I said to that student, well, let me ask you this. Do you grow your own food? And she looks, first she seemed like she was wondering why I asked that question, and then she realized what I was alluding to. And she says, no, I don't grow my own food. And I said, why not? And she says, because I can get it from the store. And I said, exactly my point. You've chosen convenience over the process and the hard work of producing for yourself. All right? This is one of the reasons why I always say to my students, do you think the Great Depression affected people living in the middle of the Amazon jungle? It was a global, worldwide economic collapse that ruined countries economically and politically. Do you think it affected the people living in the Amazon jungle? No, it did not. You know why? Because the people that are living in the Amazon jungle are likely, within their community, to produce about 100% of the things that they use on a daily basis. But we, in this economic system that we live under today, think about all the things you use on a daily basis. How much of these things that you use on a daily basis do you actually know how to produce for yourself? I'll wait. You see? So this is why one of the reasons why don't always choose convenience, because convenience makes you weak, not only physically and mentally, but convenience can make you weak, economically and politically. All right. Anyway, that's it, guys. Remember, the revolution will not be pesticides. Peace.
Land is the basis of all independence.